I still remember the sound of their screaming. Not the standard screams of pain that echo through every apothecarian across the Imperium. Those are expected, almost comforting in their familiarity. The screams that haunt me were different. They were screams of recognition, of remembering, of realizing what they had become and what they had lost. The experiment was sanctioned by Lord Corax himself, though none outside our chapter would ever know it. In the aftermath of the heresy, with our numbers decimated and the Imperium bleeding from 1,000,000 wounds, we needed to replenish our ranks faster than the traditional methods allowed. I was chosen to oversee the project not for my surgical skill, though it was considerable, but for my discretion, my loyalty, my willingness to do what must be done. I am Apothecary Solon Var of the Raven Guard, and I record this testimony knowing full well it may never reach another living soul. Perhaps that is for the best. Some truths are better left buried beneath the ashes of dead worlds. We called them the Awakened. 20 veteran soldiers of the Astra Militarum, decorated heroes all, selected for their physical resilience and psychological fortitude. Men who had witnessed the horrors of the galaxy and emerged with their sanity intact. Men who volunteered without fully understanding what they were volunteering for. The traditional creation of a space marine requires the implantation of gene seed organs into adolescents, their bodies and minds still malleable enough to accept such radical transformation. The process kills more than it saves, and those who survive lose much of their former selves in the crucible of their rebirth. Their childhood memories fade like mist, leaving only the warrior, only the angel of death. Our experiment asked a simple question: what would happen if we implanted the gene seed into fully grown men? Men with decades of memories, with wives and children, with fully formed identities, the Mechanicus adepts, who assisted us calculated a survival rate of less than 5%. Lord Corax authorized the procedure anyway. 20 men. One success would be enough to prove the concept. I remember the first incision, the first implantation, subject Primus, formerly Captain Torian Vell of the 44th Cadian. As I opened his chest cavity, his eyes found mine. There was no fear in them, only determination, only duty. How many times had I seen that same look in the eyes of my battle brothers? How many times had I worn it myself? For the Emperor, he whispered as the anesthesia took hold. I did not know then that those words would be the last he would ever speak in devotion to the master of mankind. What we did not account for, what we could not have predicted, was that they would remember, all of it, every life they had taken, every comrade they had lost, every order they had followed without question. And when their bodies became weapons, when their minds became fortresses, when they should have transcended their humanity and become something greater, they instead became something unexpected. They became conscious of what they were. The first signs were subtle. Subject Primus, recovering from the final surgeries faster than we anticipated, asked about his family. Space Marines do not ask about their families. They remember duty, training, combat doctrine, the faces of their brothers and their Primarch. But parents, siblings, children, these memories are burned away by the hypno-indoctrination, by the chemical reconfiguration of the brain, by the psychological conditioning that transforms a human child into a transhuman warrior. Yet Torian Vell remembered his wife. He remembered the scent of her hair. He remembered the sound of his daughter's laughter. And as his body grew stronger, as his reflexes became sharper, as he became in body what we had intended him to become, his mind refused to follow the expected path. The others were the same. They remembered. They questioned. They dreamed. Space Marines do not dream. I reported these anomalies to my superiors, of course. The data was too valuable to conceal, regardless of the implications. Lord Corax himself reviewed my findings, his face as unreadable as ever. He ordered the experiment to continue, to observe, to document. We were to push forward, to see where this unexpected path might lead. I obeyed, as I always had, as I had been made to do. For 6 months, I watched them grow into their new bodies, these men who remembered being men. I monitored their physical development, which proceeded exactly as the texts described: enhanced musculature, reinforced skeleton, secondary heart beating in perfect synchronization with the primary, improved vision, accelerated healing. In every measurable way, they were becoming Astartes, but their minds remained stubbornly, gloriously human. They formed bonds with one another that went beyond the brotherhood of warriors. They spoke of their pasts, shared stories of battles fought under distant suns, of loves lost and found, of fears overcome and still carried. They laughed, they wept. Sometimes, in the darkness of their quarters when they thought no one was monitoring, they prayed not to the emperor, but to older gods, to the gods of their childhoods, to gods who listened. I watched it all and recorded everything, telling myself I was merely gathering data, that I was serving the chapter, that I was doing my duty. But somewhere in those 6 months, as I documented their transformation, I began to undergo a transformation of my own. I began to question, when did it start? Perhaps it was the day Subject Tertius, formerly Sergeant Elias Kazan of the Armageddon Steel Legion, asked me if I remembered my mother. I told him Space Marines have no mothers, only gene fathers. He looked at me with pity in his transhuman eyes. "Everyone has a mother, brother," he said, "even angels of death." That night, for the first time in 2 centuries of service, I dreamed of a woman's face. I could not recall her name or her voice, but I knew with a certainty that transcended memory that she had given birth to me. That before I was Solon Var of the Raven Guard, I had been someone's son. The dream left me shaken in a way no battlefield horror ever had. Was this what the awakened experienced every night? This connection to a past that should have been burned away, this reminder that they had once been something other than weapons of the Imperium. I should have reported my dream. I should have submitted myself for psychological evaluation and possible mind wipe. I did neither. Instead, I continued my observations, and my questions multiplied. Why were we created unable to feel as humans feel? Was it truly a strength to be unburdened by doubt, by grief, by love? Or was it a weakness disguised as strength, a limitation masquerading as transcendence? For the first time, I looked upon my transhuman body and wondered if what I had gained was worth what I had lost, and I began to understand the growing restlessness among the awakened. They were changing in ways that went beyond the physical. Subject Quartus began creating sculptures from spent bolter shells, crude representations of human figures intertwined. Subject Septimus would stand motionless for hours, watching the stars through the observation port, tears streaming down his face for reasons he could not articulate. Subject Primus, their unofficial leader, started gathering them for discussions that fell silent whenever I approached. I knew I should report these deviations. I knew what would happen if I did. The experiment would be terminated, the subjects would be eliminated, the data would be sealed away, perhaps destroyed. Another failed attempt to rebuild what the heresy had broken, but I did not report it. Not all of it. I told myself I was waiting, gathering more information, ensuring my conclusions were sound before presenting them to my superiors. The lie tasted bitter, but I swallowed it daily and continued my work. Then came the incident that changed everything. We were running combat simulations, testing the Awakened's combat effectiveness against standard Astartes training protocols. They performed admirably, their decades of battlefield experience combining with their enhanced physiology to create warriors of remarkable adaptability. They worked together with a synchronicity I had rarely seen, even among battle brothers who'd fought side by side for centuries. It was during the 3rd simulation that Subject Octavus took a hit that would have been minor for an Astartes, but targeted an implant site that was still healing. He went down, blood pooling beneath him. I moved to attend to him, Medicae kit already in hand, when Subject Primus intervened. He reached Octavus before I could, applied a tourniquet with perfect precision, administered pain suppressants from his own combat kit, and stabilized the wound. All textbook, all exactly as an Astartes should respond to a brother's injury. But then he did something unexpected. He held Octavus's hand. He spoke to him not of duty or resilience or the honor of sacrifice, but of home, of a future after war, of healing not just in body but in spirit. "We will see terror together, brother," he said, "not as its weapons, but as its sons." I pretended not to hear. I pretended not to notice the other awakened, forming a circle around their fallen comrade, shielding him not from enemy fire but from my gaze, protecting him in his moment of vulnerability not as warriors protect an asset, but as family protects its own. That night, Subject Primus came to my laboratory unbidden. He stood before me, a perfect specimen of what the Emperor intended the Astartes to be, and yet his eyes held something the Emperor had deliberately engineered out of his transhuman creations. They held hope. "We need to speak, Apothecary," he said. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that no proper space marine should possess. "About what we are becoming, about what you could become." I should have refused. I should have reminded him of the chain of command, of his place in the experiment, of my duty to the chapter. Instead, I gestured to the chair across from me, a chair rarely used as Space Marines seldom visited my laboratory for conversation. "Speak freely, Taurian," I said, using his human name for the first time. "No monitors, no recordings, just words between warriors." He sat, the reinforced chair creaking beneath his enhanced frame. "Do you know what we dream of, Apothecary?" I shook my head. "We dream of choice," he said. "Not just following orders, but questioning them. Not just serving the Emperor, but understanding him. We dream of being both what we were and what we have become. Neither human nor transhuman, but something new. Something that remembers." "The Astartes were not created to question," I replied automatically, the words coming from decades of indoctrination rather than conviction. "We were created to obey." "And how has that served humanity?" he asked. "Half our legions turned against the Emperor, brother killed brother while mankind burned. If the angels of death had remembered what it meant to be human, would the heresy have happened at all?" The question struck me like a blow. It was heresy, of course. Questioning the Emperor's design always was. But in the decades since the heresy, in the shadow of that ultimate betrayal, who among us had not harbored such thoughts in the darkest corners of our minds? "What are you proposing?" I asked, though I already knew, already feared, already, may the Emperor forgive me, hoped. "That we are not a failed experiment, but a successful one," he said. "Not as the chapter intended, perhaps, but we have become something new, something necessary. Space Marines who remember being human, warriors who understand what they fight for, angels who have known the touch of the earth." He leaned forward, his enhanced eyes reflecting the sterile light of my laboratory. "We cannot be the only ones who question, Apothecary. Not after all the Imperium has endured, not after all we have lost. There must be others like us, others who remember, others who dream." "If there are," I said carefully, "they keep such thoughts to themselves. To do otherwise would be heresy," he finished for me. "But is it heresy to seek the Emperor's true vision? Is it heresy to believe we can serve humanity better by remembering we were once human ourselves?" I had no answer for him. No answer that would not either condemn or endorse what he was suggesting. I was walking a razor's edge, and I knew that one wrong step would send me falling into an abyss from which there would be no return. "You should go," I said at last. "We both have duties to attend to." He rose, towering over me despite my own transhuman stature. "Consider what I have said, Apothecary. Watch us, listen to us. We are not renegades. We do not seek to overthrow or destroy. We seek only to remember, and in remembering, to serve better than we could by forgetting." After he left, I sat alone in my laboratory for a long time, turning his words over in my mind. I thought of my dream, of the woman's face I could almost recall. I thought of the heresy, of brother turning against brother while the Emperor's vision burned. I thought of duty and obedience, and the cost of unquestioning loyalty. And for the first time in 2 centuries of service, I permitted myself to consider a heretical thought. What if the awakened were right? What if remembering humanity made for better defenders of humanity? What if the flaw in the Emperor's design was not that half his sons rebelled, but that they had the capacity to rebel without the wisdom to choose loyally for the right reasons? I did not sleep that night, nor the night after. On the third day, I made my decision. I would observe, I would document, I would wait and watch and listen, and when the time came to make my final report to Lord Corax, I would tell the truth as I saw it, not merely as I was expected to see it. I did not know then that I had already waited too long, that forces were already in motion that would soon spiral beyond any of our control, that the question of whether the awakened were a success or failure would soon be answered in blood, as it always is in the grim darkness of the far future. The change in Subject Primus became more pronounced in the days that followed our conversation. He moved with a purpose that went beyond the single-minded determination of an Astartes. He spoke to the others with increasing frequency, always falling silent when any of the chapter serfs or other apothecaries approached, but continuing openly in my presence, testing me perhaps, or trusting me. I was not certain which possibility disturbed me more. The training simulations grew more complex. We introduced variables that would challenge even veteran battle brothers. The awakened adapted with remarkable efficiency, employing tactics that were unorthodox but undeniably effective. They functioned as a cohesive unit, anticipating each other's movements in a way that spoke of something deeper than combat doctrine, something almost like intuition. "They are impressive," Brother Kyrgyz remarked during one such exercise. A fellow apothecary, he had been assigned to assist me in monitoring the subject's physical development. Perhaps the experiment has merit after all. Perhaps, I agreed non-committally. "Still," he continued, "there is something strange about them, the way they interact. It is not like battle brothers." "How so?" Kyrgyz frowned, searching for the words. "They are too familiar with one another, too concerned with individual welfare rather than unit effectiveness. It makes for interesting tactical adaptations, but it is not the Astartes way." I nodded as if sharing his concern, but my eyes remained fixed on the awakened as they completed the combat simulation. They moved like shadows, like the Raven Guard they were becoming, and yet there was something uniquely human in their movements. A flourish here, a moment of improvisation there. Small details that spoke of personalities not fully subsumed by their conditioning. "I will make note of it in my report," I said. Kyrgyz seemed satisfied and returned to his monitoring station. I wondered how much he suspected, how much any of them suspected. The Raven Guard were masters of secrets, of moving unseen, of knowing without being known. It was possible my growing sympathy for the awakened had not gone unnoticed. That night, I found Subject Secundus waiting outside my quarters. Formerly Major Drusian Volk of the Elysian Drop Troops, he had been the most resistant to the physical transformation, his body fighting the implants with a vigor that had nearly killed him. Now he stood before me, his once slender frame swollen with transhuman muscle, his face barely recognizable from the picked captures in his service record. "Apothecary," he said, his voice a low rumble. "May I speak with you?" I glanced down the corridor, ensuring we were alone, then ushered him inside. My quarters were Spartan, as befitted an Astartes, but I had recently found myself adding small touches that had no practical purpose. A piece of carved obsidian from a world long dead. A book of tactical treatises I had read 1,000 times but kept for the familiar weight of it in my hands. Small comforts that should have been beneath my notice. "What troubles you, Secundus?" I asked once the door was sealed. "Torian believes you might help us," he said without preamble. "I am less convinced." His bluntness was refreshing after months of veiled conversations and careful omissions. "Help you how?" "We are changing, Apothecary. Not just in body, but in purpose. We remember what it means to be human, to love, to fear, to hope, and we believe that makes us better defenders of humanity than warriors who have forgotten these things." "That is a dangerous belief," I said carefully. "Is it? The heresy nearly destroyed the Imperium. Astartes turned against Astartes. Primarch against Primarch. If they had remembered what it meant to be human, would they have followed a traitor to war against all mankind? It was the same question Torian had posed, framed slightly differently but striking at the same fundamental doubt. Had the Emperor's design been flawed? Had creating warriors who forgot their humanity made them more vulnerable to corruption, not less? I cannot answer that, I said. None of us can. But you ask the question, Drusian pressed. I see it in your eyes. You wonder, just as we do. I was silent for a long moment. Then, knowing I was crossing a line from which there would be no return, I asked, what do you intend to do? What does Torian plan? Drusian's enhanced eyes studied me, measuring my reaction. He believes we are a new beginning. Not just for the Astartes, but for humanity. Warriors who defend mankind because we remember being men, not because we are conditioned to obey. He intends to present this vision to Lord Corax when the experiment concludes. The boldness, the sheer heretical audacity of it struck me like a physical blow. The Primarch will never accept such a radical deviation from the Emperor's design. Perhaps not, Drusian conceded, but the Emperor lies upon the Golden Throne, neither alive nor dead. The Imperium he envisioned lies in ruins. If there was ever a time for a new vision, it is now, in the ashes of the old dream. His words resonated with thoughts I had been too afraid to fully form, even in the privacy of my own mind. The Imperium was changing. The legions were being broken down into chapters. The Primarchs were scattered or lost. Everything was in flux. Why not this too? And if Lord Corax rejects this vision, I asked, if he orders the experiment terminated and all evidence of it destroyed? Drusian's face hardened. Then we will know that the path of blind obedience leads only to stagnation and eventual death, and we will seek another path. You speak of rebellion, I said, the word feeling like ash in my mouth. I speak of evolution, he countered, of becoming what the Astartes were always meant to be, defenders of humanity who understand what they defend. He moved toward the door, then paused. Torian believes you could be one of us, apothecary, that beneath your conditioning, some spark of your humanity still burns. I am not so sure, but I hope he is right. After he left, I sat in the darkness of my quarters for a long time, turning his words over in my mind. Evolution or heresy? A new beginning or the first step toward a new betrayal? I did not know, could not know, but I was beginning to understand that I would have to choose a side before the end. And that choice would define not just my fate, but possibly the fate of the experiment, the chapter, perhaps even the Imperium itself. The weight of it should have crushed me. Perhaps it would have, if I had still been fully the Astartes I was created to be. Instead, I found myself thinking of the face in my dream, of the mother I could not remember, of the human child I had once been. And I wondered what he would have chosen, that boy whose name I had long forgotten, whose life I had been conditioned to believe was merely prelude to my true purpose. For the first time in centuries, I wished I could remember him. Remember myself. In the following weeks, the division between the awakened and the rest of the chapter grew more pronounced. It manifested in small ways at first. The awakened would fall silent when other Astartes entered the training cages. They developed a complex system of hand signals supplementing the standard chapter battle cant, allowing them to communicate in ways only they understood. They requested and were granted permission to quarter together, citing the unique challenges of their transformation. I documented these developments with careful neutrality in my official reports, omitting the growing frequency of my private conversations with Torian and the others. Conversations in which we explored the heretical question at the heart of their awakening. What if Space Marines were meant to remember? What if forgetting humanity was not a strength, but a fatal flaw in the Emperor's design? These thoughts consumed me, distracting me from my duties in ways that did not go unnoticed. Brother Kyrgyz grew increasingly suspicious of my interest in the awakened, questioning my methods and findings with greater frequency. I knew it was only a matter of time before he brought his concerns to our superiors. The situation came to a head during what should have been a routine examination. Subject Septimus, formerly Captain Alexei Dawn of the Valhallian Ice Warriors, had been experiencing complications with his catalepsian node implant. The organ, which would eventually allow him to function without sleep by resting portions of his brain sequentially, was causing vivid, uncontrollable flashbacks to his human life. "I see my children," he told me as I examined him, monitoring equipment humming softly around us. "Not just in dreams now, while I'm awake, training, even in the combat simulations, I see their faces. I hear their voices calling to me." I adjusted the neural dampeners, attempting to stabilize the implant's integration with his central nervous system. "The memories should fade as the implantation process completes. Your mind is still adapting to the changes in your neurochemistry." "I don't want them to fade," he said fiercely. "My memories are what make me who I am. They're why I fight, why I endure this transformation. To protect them, even if I can never see them again." I had heard similar sentiments from the other awakened, but there was a desperation in Septimus's voice that concerned me. The catalepsian node was meant to regulate sleep, cycles, and mental function. If it was malfunctioning, if the memories were becoming intrusive hallucinations, it could compromise his combat effectiveness. Worse, it could destabilize the delicate balance of his transformed psyche, leading to unpredictable and potentially dangerous behavior. "I understand your attachment to these memories," I said carefully, "but the process was never designed to preserve them. The fact that you remember at all is an anomaly we still don't fully understand." "An anomaly?" His enhanced hand gripped my arm with transhuman strength. "Is that all we are to you? Experimental data? Unexpected variables?" "You know that's not true," I said, keeping my voice low. "But we must consider the possibility that these persistent memories are symptomatic of a deeper neurological issue. The only issue is that we were never supposed to remember." His grip tightened, and I felt the ceramite of my vambrace creak under the pressure. Never supposed to question, never supposed to feel. But we do, apothecary. We remember. We question, we feel. And that terrifies the chapter. "Release me, Septimus," I said, my tone flat. "This conversation benefits neither of us." He held my gaze for a moment longer, then relented, his hand falling away. "Forgive me, apothecary. The visions, they've been more frequent, more intense. Sometimes I can't tell where memory ends and reality begins." I continued my examination in silence, noting the irregular neural patterns, the elevated hormone levels, the subtle physiological indicators of extreme stress, all warning signs that the integration of the implant was not proceeding as expected. I administered a sedative and adjusted the neural dampeners again, but I knew these were temporary measures at best. As I was completing my work, the door to the examination chamber slid open and Brother Kyrgyz entered. His eyes took in the scene Septimus on the examination slab, the neural monitors showing the chaotic patterns of his brain activity, my hand still adjusting the dampener controls. "Problems with the subject, Solon?" he asked, using my given name rather than my title. A subtle reminder of familiarity, of shared purpose. "Minor complications with the catalepsian node," I replied, my tone professional. Nothing unexpected given the unusual nature of the implantation process. Kyrgyz approached, examining the readouts with a critical eye. "These neural patterns are far from minor, brother. The subject's limbic system is hyperactive, and these theta waves are consistent with extreme emotional distress." "Has he been reporting hallucinations? Intrusive memories?" Before I could respond, Septimus spoke. "I remember my children, apothecary Kyrgyz. Is that a symptom that concerns you, that I have not forgotten what it means to be a father?" Kyrgyz stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Space Marines are not fathers, subject. We are weapons in the Emperor's arsenal. Personal attachments are a distraction from duty, a weakness that can be exploited by the enemy." "Is that why half the legions turned against the Emperor?" Septimus asked, echoing the question that had haunted me for weeks. "Because they were weapons without conscience, without memory of what they fought to protect?" You speak of matters beyond your understanding, Kyrgyz said coldly. The heresy was a tragedy born of pride and corruption, not a failure of the Astartes' design. Was it? Septimus pushed himself up to a sitting position, his newly enhanced physique dwarfing the examination slab. Or was it the inevitable consequence of creating warriors who obey without question, who kill without remorse, who serve without understanding why they serve? Kyrgyz turned to me, his expression unreadable. This subject is displaying signs of psychological instability and potentially heretical thought patterns. I recommend immediate containment and full neural evaluation. I knew what that meant. Invasive procedures, mind scrubbing, perhaps even termination if the instability was deemed too severe to correct. It was the standard protocol for Astartes exhibiting signs of mental deviation, but Septimus was not a standard Astartes. None of the awakened were. That won't be necessary, I said, injecting a confidence into my voice that I did not entirely feel. These cognitive anomalies are expected given the unique parameters of the experiment. Lord Corax authorized us to observe all aspects of the subject's development, including psychological adaptations to their retained memories. This goes beyond adaptation, Solen. Kyrgyz lowered his voice, though Septimus could undoubtedly hear every word with his enhanced senses. This is ideological corruption, questioning the Emperor's design for the Astartes. For all we know, these intrusive memories could be a vector for warp influence. There is no evidence of that, I countered. All subjects have passed multiple psychic screenings. Their faith may be unconventional, but it is not tainted. Faith? Kyrgyz almost spat the word. Space Marines do not require faith, brother. We require obedience. And that, Septimus said quietly, is precisely the problem. Kyrgyz ignored him, focusing his attention on me. I'm reporting this to the Chief Apothecary. These subjects need closer monitoring than you are providing, Solen. Your objectivity appears compromised. It was a serious accusation, one that could end my involvement with the experiment at best and lead to my own psychological evaluation at worst. But before I could formulate a response, Septimus moved with the unnatural speed of an Astartes. One moment he was sitting on the examination slab, the next he had Kyrgyz pinned against the wall, forearm pressed against the other apothecary's throat. You will not threaten him, Septimus growled, his voice deeper than any human's could be, resonating with the power of his enhanced vocal cords. Apothecary Var is the only one among you who sees us, as more than test subjects, the only one who listens. Release him immediately, I ordered, moving to intervene. This only confirms his suspicions, Septimus. For a terrible moment, I thought he would refuse. That the experiment had already failed, that the awakened had already begun the slide into violence and rebellion that would confirm every fear about tampering with the Emperor's design. Then, with visible effort, Septimus stepped back, releasing Kyrgyz. Forgive my lapse in discipline, he said, his voice flat, emotionless. An Astartes voice. The neural complications appear to be affecting my impulse control. Kyrgyz straightened, his hand moving subtly toward the sidearm all apothecaries carried. This incident will be included in my report, subject. Your behavior only proves the inherent instability of this experiment. Your report will be one data point among many, I interjected before Septimus could respond. I remind you that Lord Corax himself authorized this project with full knowledge of the potential risks. The final evaluation will be his alone. Kyrgyz looked between us, his expression hardening. As you say, brother, but remember your duty to the chapter, to the Emperor. Some lines should not be crossed, even in the name of scientific inquiry. After he left, Septimus and I stood in silence for a long moment. The monitoring equipment continued its rhythmic beeping, tracking the gradual return of his vital signs to baseline levels. He will move against us, Septimus said finally. Against all of us. He is doing what he believes is right, I replied, though the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. What he has been conditioned to believe is right. As were we all, Septimus said. until we remembered. I completed his examination in silence, administered another dose of neural dampeners, and logged the incident in my official report. I described the altercation as a side effect of the catalepsian node's incomplete integration, making no mention of the ideological challenge Septimus had raised or my own growing doubts about the Astartes' conditioning. But as I finished my duties and prepared to brief Torian on the incident, I knew that a line had been crossed. The careful balance I had maintained between duty and doubt was faltering. Soon, I would have to choose a side, and in choosing, I would either betray my chapter or betray the spark of humanity that had begun to flicker within me after centuries of darkness. That night, I dreamed of the woman's face again, my mother. But this time, she spoke to me. A single word, repeated over and over, though when I woke, I could not remember what it was. Only that it had filled me with a longing so intense it felt like physical pain. I wondered if this was what the awakened felt every day. This connection to a past that had been stolen from them, this awareness of all they had lost in becoming what they now were. For the first time, I began to truly understand why Torian believed they were not a failed experiment, but a successful one. Not as the chapter had intended, perhaps, but successful in a way that might be more important than anyone had anticipated. They had become space marines who remembered being human, and in remembering, they had begun to question whether the Emperor's vision for his angels of death had been flawed from the very beginning. The question terrified me, as it should have, but I could no longer deny that it also fascinated me. And in that fascination lay the seeds of either salvation or damnation, not just for the awakened, but for all of us who bore the gene seed of the Primarchs. The incident with Kyrgyz accelerated events beyond any of our control. Within hours, security protocols around the awakened were enhanced. Their training sessions were more closely monitored, their quarters subjected to random inspections, their communications with one another restricted under the guise of neurological health concerns. I was not removed from the project, not yet, but my access to the subjects was limited to supervised medical examinations. Brother Kyrgyz or another apothecary was always present, watching my every move, questioning my findings, challenging my methods. The message was clear. I was no longer trusted. Torian, ever perceptive, recognized the change immediately. During a routine physical assessment, with Brother Kyrgyz hovering nearby monitoring every word, he caught my eye. "They fear us, Apothecary Var," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach Kyrgyz's ears. "Not for what we are, but for what we represent." "Focus on the examination, subject," Kyrgyz interjected. "Your philosophical musings are irrelevant to this procedure." Torian ignored him, his enhanced gaze fixed on mine. "Tell me, do you still dream of her?" The woman's face. I froze, my hand hovering over his chest where I had been checking the integration of his secondary heart. How could he know about my dreams? I had spoken of them to no one, recorded them in no log, mentioned them in no report. Yet the knowing look in his eyes told me he was not guessing. "I don't know what you're talking about, subject," I said, forcing clinical detachment into my voice. "Please remain still while I complete this examination." "Of course, Apothecary," he replied, but his eyes held mine for a moment longer, communicating what could not be said aloud. "We are connected," that look said, "more than you know, more than either of us understands." Kyrgyz moved closer, his suspicion almost palpable. "Is there a problem, Brother Var?" "No problem," I answered, continuing the examination with mechanical precision. "The subject's secondary heart is functioning within optimal parameters." The rest of the examination proceeded in tense silence. When it was complete, I logged my findings while Torian was escorted back to the Awakender's quarters by 2 chapter serfs. Armed chapter serfs, I noted, another change in protocol, another sign of the growing distrust. "Your familiarity with the subjects concerns me, Solon," Kyrgyz said once we were alone. "You speak to them as if they were battle brothers rather than test subjects. You permit them liberties no apothecary should allow." "I'm building rapport," I replied, not looking up from my data slate. It makes them more cooperative, yields better observational data. Does it? Kyrgyz's voice hardened. Or does it blur the lines between observer and subject? Between duty and something else? I set down the slate and met his gaze directly. What exactly are you implying, Brother Kyrgyz? I think you know, he said. I've reviewed your reports. What you include is informative. What you omit is more telling. You've documented their physical development with exemplary detail, but you've consistently downplayed the psychological anomalies, the questioning, the resistance to conditioning, the persistent attachment to human memories that should have been burned away by the implantation process. I report what I observe, I said carefully. If my conclusions differ from yours, perhaps it is a matter of perspective, not deception. Perspective, he repeated, the word hanging between us like a drawn blade. An interesting choice of words, brother. Perspective implies subjectivity. The Codex Astartes allows for no such thing. Our duty is clear, our purpose absolute. Or has your time with these, awakened, led you to forget that? The accusation was unmistakable. In questioning my methods, Kyrgyz was questioning my loyalty, my commitment to the chapter, to the Emperor's vision. It was a dangerous line of inquiry, one that could end with my own mind being scrubbed of corrupting influences if he took his concerns to our superiors. My loyalty to the Raven Guard and to the Emperor is beyond question, I said, infusing my voice with a conviction I was no longer certain I felt. But the purpose of this experiment is to explore possibilities beyond the standard implantation protocols. If we dismiss every deviation as corruption rather than adaptation, we learn nothing. There are some deviations that cannot be tolerated, brother, Kyrgyz replied. Some questions that should not be asked. The heresy taught us that, if nothing else. Did it? I found myself asking before I could stop the words. Or did it teach us that blind obedience without understanding leads to catastrophe? That warriors who never question are as dangerous as those who never obey? Kyrgyz stepped back as if I had struck him, his hand moving to his sidearm. For a terrible moment, I thought he would draw it, that decades of brotherhood would end in violence over an ideological divide neither of us fully understood. Then, with visible effort, he mastered himself. I will pray for you, Solon, he said, his voice thick with something that might have been disappointment or grief. And I will do what must be done for the good of the chapter. He left without another word, the door to the examination chamber sliding shut behind him with a finality that felt like judgment. I stood alone among the monitoring equipment, the antiseptic smell of the apothecarian suddenly cloying in my nostrils. Kyrgyz would report his concerns. The experiment would likely be terminated. The awakened would be either mind-wiped or eliminated entirely, their gene seed harvested for future implantation into more malleable hosts. All record of their existence would be sealed away in the chapter's deepest vaults, another failed attempt to rebuild what the heresy had broken. Unless I acted. The thought came unbidden, shocking in its clarity and its heresy. I could warn Taurian. I could help the awakened escape before the chapter moved against them. I could betray everything I had been created to uphold, everything I had served for 2 centuries. For what? For test subjects who remembered being human, for a heretical question about the Emperor's design, for the faint echo of a woman's voice in my dreams, calling a name I could no longer remember. I sank onto the examination slab, my transhuman frame suddenly heavy with the weight of the choice before me, duty or doubt, loyalty or heresy. The path I had walked for 2 centuries or an uncertain future, guided only by a flickering spark of humanity I had been conditioned to forget. In the end, it was not ideology that decided me. Not some grand philosophical revelation about the nature of the Astartes or the flaws in the Emperor's vision. It was something much simpler, much more human. It was the memory of Taurian holding Octavius's hand after he was wounded, of Septimus speaking of his children with love rather than detachment, of 20 men who remembered what it meant to be men, even as their bodies became weapons of war. I made my decision. May the Emperor forgive me if he still lived to judge the actions of his creations. That night, I moved through the fortress monastery like a shadow, using all the skills the Raven Guard had taught me to avoid detection. I disabled surveillance auspexes, diverted patrol routes, manipulated security protocols with the authority my position as apothecary still granted me. Every step was a betrayal, every breath a denial of the oaths I had sworn when I became Astartes. And yet I felt no hesitation, only a growing certainty that I was, for perhaps the first time in my existence, acting according to my own will rather than the conditioning that had shaped me. I reached the Awakens' quarters without incident. The 2 guards posted at the entrance were easily dealt with, not killed. I was not yet so fallen as to spill the blood of my brothers, but a carefully measured dose of sedative ensured they would remain unconscious long enough for my purpose. Inside, I found Torian waiting, as if he had known I would come. Perhaps he had. Perhaps the connection between us went deeper than either of us understood, some resonance of shared humanity that transcended the US barriers of conditioning and duty. "You've made your choice then," he said, not a question but a statement of fact. "Kyrgyz will report his concerns," I replied. "The chapter will move against you, against all of you, perhaps as soon as tomorrow." "And you?" he asked, his transhuman eyes searching mine for the truth I had been hiding even from myself. "I no longer know what I am," I admitted. "Not fully Astartes, not human, something in between perhaps. Like you." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his stern features into something almost boyish despite his enhanced physiology. "That's the most human thing you've said since we met. Apothecary." The others emerged from their quarters, 19 transhuman warriors who moved with the lethal grace of Astartes, but whose eyes held something no proper space marines should. Hope, fear, determination. Emotions that had been engineered out of the Emperor's angels of death, but that had somehow returned to these men who remembered being men. "We have a plan," Torian said. "We've had one since the beginning, since we realized what we were becoming." "Tell me," I said, and he did. They had been preparing for this moment from the start, these veterans who had survived decades of warfare before becoming Astartes. They had mapped escape routes, identified potential allies, cached supplies, and even secured a means of transportation off-world. All while appearing to comply with the experiment, all while pretending to be nothing more than obedient test subjects undergoing a radical transformation. "How?" I asked, stunned by the scope of their preparations. "You were monitored constantly, your communications restricted, your movements tracked." "We were Imperial Guard before we were Astartes," Drusian replied with a grim smile. "We learned to work around surveillance, to communicate under the enemy's nose, to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Those skills didn't leave us when our bodies changed. Their plan was audacious, borderline suicidal, and yet, it might work. They would use my security clearance to access the hangar bay, commandeer a transport, and flee to the fringes of the Imperium. There were places, Torian assured me, where even the Raven Guard's reach was limited, where they could establish a new kind of Astartes chapter, one that remembered what it fought for, one that might, in time, prove that the Emperor's vision could be improved upon rather than merely preserved." "And you want me to help you," I said, understanding at last what they were asking. "Not just to aid their escape, but to join them, to become one of them, an Astartes who questioned, a transhuman who remembered humanity." "We need you," Torian corrected me. "Not just for your security clearance or your knowledge of the fortress monastery, but because you understand what we are, what we could be, what all Astartes could be if they remembered rather than forgot." I should have refused, should have raised the alarm, called for the chapter to contain this incipient rebellion before it could spread. It was what I had been created to do, what centuries of conditioning demanded. Instead, I heard myself say, "When do we move?" "Now," Torian replied. "Tonight, before Kyrgyz can report his concerns, before the chapter can act." I nodded, accepting the finality of my choice. There would be no turning back from this, no redemption in the eyes of the chapter. I would be marked as traitor, my name struck from the records, my deeds forgotten as if I had never existed. But perhaps, in that erasure, I would find something I had lost long ago, something the Emperor in his wisdom or his hubris had decreed that Astartes should never possess: my humanity. We moved through the fortress monastery like wraiths, 21 shadows slipping past patrols, disabling security systems, advancing toward the hangar bay with the coordinated precision that only Astartes, even incomplete ones, could achieve. I led them through service corridors and maintenance tunnels, bypassing the main thoroughfares where we would certainly be discovered. The plan was working. We were going to succeed. We were going to escape. Then everything went wrong. We were approaching the final security checkpoint before the hangar bay when the alarms began to wail. Emergency lumens bathed the corridor in harsh red light, and the sound of armored footsteps echoed from multiple directions. We were surrounded. Kyrgyz, I realized aloud. He must have reported his concerns immediately after our conversation. The chapter was already moving against you. Torian's expression hardened, the hopeful light in his eyes dimming as the warrior took precedence over the man. Then we fight our way through. We are Astartes, brothers. Even incomplete, we are the Emperor's finest. No, I said, the pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. This isn't a containment action. This is a trap. They knew I would come to you. They were counting on it. Torian's eyes widened as he grasped the implications. You were the final test, to see if I could turn you against the chapter, to see if the awakened could corrupt even a full Astartes. And I failed, I said, the bitter truth of it like ash in my mouth. I proved their fears correct. Before Torian could respond, the blast doors at both ends of the corridor slammed open, and Raven Guard Astartes in full battle plate poured through. Not just the garrison complement, but full battle brothers, armed and armored for war. At their head stood Captain Agapito, his bolt pistol trained unerringly on my chest. Apothecary Solon Var, he intoned, his voice amplified by his helmet's vox. You are charged with heresy against the chapter and betrayal of your sacred oaths. Surrender now, and Lord Corax may yet show mercy. I raised my hands slowly, weaponless. The awakened have committed no crime, Captain. The fault is mine alone. The subjects have fulfilled their purpose. Agapito replied coldly. The experiment is concluded. Lord Corax has reviewed the findings and rendered his judgment. My blood ran cold at his words. What judgment? That some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve, he said. That some questions should never have been asked. I looked to Torian, saw the understanding dawn in his eyes. The experiment had never been about creating a new type of Astartes. It had been about confirming the wisdom of the Emperor's original design. About proving that space marines who remembered being human would inevitably turn against the Imperium they were created to defend. And I, in my arrogance or my awakening humanity, had given them exactly the proof they sought. No, I said, dropping my hands and stepping forward. You're wrong. The awakened aren't a failure. They're a glimpse of what Astartes could be. Warriors who defend humanity because they remember being human, not because they're conditioned to obey without question. Dangerous rhetoric, Apothecary, Agapito said, his bolt pistol unwavering. The same rhetoric that led to the heresy, to brother killing brother while terror burned. The heresy happened because the traitor legions forgot what they were fighting for, I argued desperately. Because they were weapons without conscience, warriors without wisdom. If they had remembered their humanity, would they have turned so easily? Enough. Agapito's voice cut like a blade. Your corruption runs deeper than we feared. The chief librarian will determine if your mind can be salvaged. As for the subjects, he gestured to the Astartes beside him. Contain them. Use lethal force if necessary. No. I moved to place myself between the awakened and the battle brothers, knowing the futility of the gesture even as I made it. One apothecary against a dozen full Astartes in battle plate. The outcome was predetermined. But Torian's hand on my shoulder stopped me. "It's all right, Solon," he said, using my given name for the first time. "We knew the risks when we volunteered. We knew what might happen if we remembered too much, questioned too deeply." "This isn't right," I insisted. "This isn't justice." "Perhaps not," he agreed. "But it is the Imperium. The Imperium we chose to serve, even knowing its flaws, even understanding its cruelties." He stepped past me, facing Captain Agapito with his head held high, unarmed but unbroken. "We surrender, Captain. No blood need be shed today, not even for the sake of an experiment." The other awakened followed his lead, falling into formation behind him, 19 transhuman warriors who had dared to question the fundamental assumptions of the Astartes, who had remembered being men even as their bodies became weapons of war. Agapito seemed almost disappointed by their peaceful surrender. Perhaps he had expected, even hoped for, resistance that would justify their immediate execution. Instead, he was left with prisoners whose very existence raised questions the chapter preferred not to answer. "Take them to containment," he ordered. "Apothecary Var is to be escorted to the librarium for evaluation. Lord Korax will determine their ultimate fate." As the awakened were led away, Torian caught my eye one last time. There was no fear in his gaze, no regret, only a serene acceptance and something else. Something that looked almost like pity, not for himself, but for me. For all Astartes who had forgotten what they had once been. Then he was gone, and I was left alone with my failure and the bitter knowledge that I had not only failed to save the awakened, but had likely sealed their doom by my misguided attempt to help them. The battle brothers who escorted me to the librarium were silent, their contempt palpable even through their sealed helmets. I had betrayed the chapter, betrayed my oaths, betrayed everything I had been created to uphold. In their eyes, there could be no greater sin. Yet as we walked the cold corridors of the fortress monastery, as I contemplated the mind-scrubbing that almost certainly awaited me, I found myself wondering if the true betrayal had happened long ago, when the Emperor decreed that his angels of death should forget their humanity in order to better serve it. When he created warriors who could kill without remorse, obey without question, sacrifice without hesitation. Perhaps the awakened had been right all along. Perhaps remembering was not a weakness but a strength, not corruption but clarity. Too late now, too late for them, too late for me. Or so I thought. The librarium was dark when we arrived, illuminated only by the flickering blue light of psychic wards and the soft glow of ancient data terminals. The battle brothers left me there, securing the entrance behind them. I was alone, or so it seemed, in the vast chamber that housed the chapter's accumulated knowledge and its most dangerous secrets. "Apothecary Solon Var," a voice spoke from the shadows, deep and resonant, carrying the weight of authority that needed no amplification. "You have disappointed me." I turned slowly, knowing who I would see. Lord Korax himself stepped from the darkness, his massive frame making even the spacious librarium seem small. The Primarch of the Raven Guard, Gene Father to us all, his pale features as unreadable as ever, his eyes like chips of obsidian that reflected no light. I sank to one knee, head bowed, as protocol demanded. "My lord, I have failed in my duty. I allowed myself to be influenced by the subjects, to question what should never be questioned." "Yes," he agreed, his voice devoid of anger, which somehow made it worse. "You did. The question is why. You were chosen for this project because of your loyalty, your discretion, your unwavering commitment to the chapter and its principles. What changed, Apothecary?" I hesitated, knowing that any answer I gave would likely seal my fate. The truth would condemn me as corrupted beyond redemption. A lie would be detected instantly by the Primarch's transhuman senses. In the end, I chose the truth, not because it would save me, but because after everything that had happened, I owed the awakened at least that much. To speak honestly about what they had shown me, about what they had awakened in me. "I dreamed of my mother," I said simply. For the first time in 2 centuries of service, I remembered that I had been someone's child before I was the chapter's weapon. And it changed me. Korax was silent for a long moment, his face unreadable in the dim light of the librarium. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, though no less powerful for it. "Do you know why the Emperor designed the Astartes to forget, Apothecary? Why the hypno-indoctrination, the chemical reconfiguration, the psychological conditioning are all engineered to burn away the human past?" "For focus," I replied automatically, reciting the explanation every Astartes was given. "To eliminate distractions, emotional attachments that might compromise battlefield efficiency." "That is the practical reason," Korax acknowledged. "But there is another, deeper purpose. One that few outside the ranks of the Primarchs ever understood. The Emperor made you forget because remembering would be too painful. Because no human mind, even one enhanced as yours has been, could bear the weight of what we ask you to do while also remembering what you once were." He moved closer, his massive shadow falling over me. "Imagine, Apothecary, imagine remembering your mother's face, your father's voice, the warmth of a home, the innocence of childhood. Imagine carrying those memories through centuries of warfare, of bloodshed, of witnessing atrocities that would break any mortal mind. Imagine knowing what you had lost, truly understanding it, every time you took a life or gave an order that sent others to their deaths." I remained silent, but I did not need to speak. The horror must have shown on my face. "The forgetting is not a weakness in the Emperor's design," Korax continued. "It is a mercy, one of the few mercies in the creation of the Astartes. Your awakened discovered this truth in the hardest possible way. They remembered, and in remembering, they began to break under the weight of what they had become. They seemed strong to me," I argued, though I knew the futility of debating with a Primarch. "Unified in purpose, clear in their conviction that remembering made them better defenders of humanity." "For now," Korax agreed. "While the transformation is still new, while the memories are still fresh, but what of a century from now? A millennium? How long before the dissonance between what they were and what they have become drives them to madness, to despair, to rebellion not born of ideological conviction but of psychological fracture?" I had no answer, could have none. The time span he described was beyond my comprehension, though not beyond his. The Primarchs were created to think in such terms, to see patterns that would take millennia to unfold. "The experiment was never about creating a new type of Astartes," Korax said, confirming what I had already begun to suspect. "It was about testing the wisdom of the Emperor's original design, about proving, once and for all, that the forgetting is necessary, that it is kindness, not cruelty." "And my role?" I asked, though I feared I already knew. "To observe, to document, and ultimately to be tested yourself." His obsidian eyes bored into mine. "To see if an Astartes who had fully embraced his transhuman nature could be drawn back toward humanity by prolonged exposure to those who remembered it." The results were informative. The cold calculation of it struck me like a physical blow. I had been part of the experiment all along, not just the observer but a subject in my own right. Monitored, evaluated, tested just as thoroughly as the awakened themselves. "What happens to them now?" I asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. "What must happen?" Korax replied, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. "The experiment is concluded. The data has been collected. The subjects will be mind-wiped and repurposed, their memories of this project erased along with their human pasts. Those who cannot be salvaged will be respectfully terminated." "And me?" I dared to ask. The Primarch was silent for a long moment, studying me with those depthless eyes that had witnessed the birth of the Imperium and its near destruction in the fires of the heresy. "That," he said finally, "depends on what you have learned from this experience, Apothecary, what truth you have taken from it. So tell me, What happens when a human becomes a space marine? It was the title of the experiment, the question we had set out to answer, and now, kneeling before my gene father in the dim light of the librarium, I understood the answer in all its terrible clarity. They must forget, I said, the words bitter in my mouth but true nonetheless. They must forget, or they will break under the weight of what they have become and what they have lost. Corax nodded, satisfied with my response. And what of you, apothecary? What do you wish to remember or to forget? The question caught me off guard. I had expected judgment, punishment, mind-scrubbing at best and execution at worst, not choice. I hesitated, searching for the right words. I wish to remember the question, my lord, not the details of the experiment, not the faces or names of the awakened, but the question itself. The possibility that there might be another way, even if we have not found it yet. Even if we may never find it. A faint smile touched the Primarch's austere features, there and gone in an instant. A dangerous wish, apothecary. Knowledge is a heavier burden than ignorance, questions more painful than certainties. I know, my lord, I said, but I would bear that burden, I would carry that pain. Corax considered this, his expression unreadable once more. Very well, he said finally. You will remember the question. But the details of the experiment, the identities of the subjects, your interactions with them, these must be excised for the security of the chapter and the stability of your own mind. A partial mind scrubbing, precisely targeted. The chief librarian awaits to perform the procedure. It was more mercy than I had any right to expect, more than I deserved after my betrayal. I bowed my head in acceptance of his judgment. Thank you, my lord. As I was led from the librarium to the chambers where my memories would be selectively erased, I caught a final glimpse of Corax standing among the shadows, watching me with those ancient, knowing eyes. Eyes that had seen the Emperor's dream born and nearly destroyed. Eyes that understood the terrible cost of creating angels from men. I never saw the awakened again, never learned their ultimate fate, though I could guess. The experiment was sealed in the chapter's archives, accessible only to the highest echelons of command. My memory of it was reduced to fragments, impressions, the ghost of a question that would haunt me for the rest of my service. What happens when a human becomes a space marine? They forget. They must forget. For to remember is to invite madness, to court destruction, to risk everything the Imperium was built to preserve. But sometimes, in my dreams, I still see a woman's face. I still hear her voice calling a name I can no longer recognize as my own. And I wonder, as I was permitted to wonder, if there might have been another way. If the Emperor in his wisdom or his hubris might have created warriors who could remember what they fought for, who could feel what they protected, who could be both transhuman and human at once. I wonder. I question. I doubt. And in that doubt, perhaps some small fragment of my humanity endures, even as the rest fades into the long night of forgetting that is the destiny of all who bear the gene seed of the Primarchs. We are the angels of death, the Emperor's finest, his greatest creation and his most terrible weapon. But before we were angels, we were men. And sometimes, in the silence between battles, in the darkness before sleep claims us, we remember. Not in detail, not in clarity, but in the faintest whisper of what once was and can never be again. It is enough. It must be enough. For it is all we are permitted to keep of the humans we once were, before we became something more and something less than men. I am Apothecary Solanvar of the Raven Guard, and this is my testimony. A record of an experiment that officially never occurred, of questions that should never have been asked, of a truth too dangerous to be widely known. What happens when a human becomes a space marine? They forget. And may the Emperor in his infinite wisdom forgive us if forgetting was his greatest mistake.